and the movement to Kimpok from Guatemala. We ask participants that they ask their questions through the chat and we will answer them later. Thank you very much. So now Cristina Prego has the word.
Thank you, Georgina. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. It is a pleasure to meet you today under these circumstances to exchange, to discuss, and to know the result of the reports, as Georgina said. The reports of our region in Central America, South, and the Andean region, so that we can exchange our opinions based on these results. Today I will be the moderator, and I will be moderating this exchange today. And also we will be exchanging our views based on the questions that you ask. This is also live on the Talking Pops Facebook, and we thank them for the collaboration. We would like to say hello as well to Percy Alvarado, who says hello from Cuba. And I am sure that we will be more people also in our work that will be together with us. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to share their reports, and we will ask them to please speak slowly because, as Georgina was saying before, today we have simultaneous interpretation, so it is in everyone's interest to speak slowly so that we can communicate correctly. We made a little change with the order of speakers, and we will begin this exchange with Marita, afterwards with Laura, and then in the third place we will have Camilo. So remember, you have 15 minutes, each of you, and then we will have some questions, and we will have also some other questions for each speaker so that they can provide some answers. Again, will be around 15 minutes, and then we will close with some conclusions related to the inputs of every speaker. So now we will begin with Marita Gonzalez from Argentina, and she will be sharing with us the study case that was carried out in her country, in Argentina, in the framework of PAMPA platform, which is a platform that makes a monitoring of the 2030 agenda in her country. It is a political advocacy platform led by different social actors, human rights organizations, trade unions, foundations, NGOs, environment organizations, also faith-based organizations. So as you can see, it is a multi-stakeholder space, and they carried out this study, and the responsive organization was the Encuentro organization. So thank you very much, Marita. When you have reached the 12 minutes, I will tell you so that you know that you have 3 minutes left. Okay, well, I hope to be faster than that. Good afternoon, everyone. And in the case of our colleagues from Philippines, I know it is very early in the morning for you, and I am sure that you had to wake up very early. I will share my screen right now, and please let me know if you can see that, and if everyone is okay with that. Thank you so much. As Cristina was saying before, this work was carried out by the monitoring organization for the 2030 agenda, and it is a multi-stakeholder platform with trade unions, social organizations, NGOs, human rights organizations, environmentalists, etc. So this is the team that carried out this report, and I would like to mention them because, of course, it is just one voice of the many people who have worked in this report. Néstor Borri, Mesela Braco, Marita Gonzalez, Nahuel Gravano, Siquilla, and Carolina Bonortel. Many of them are here in this session, and I would like to thank them for their work. I know it was an exhaustive work. I will try to make a summary of the general document because this has 70 pages and we are still working on that, especially because in the last part we were consulted and we made a research about all the activities carried out by the civil organizations in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The activity is very strong, and that's why we are still working on that and trying to add all the activities from these organizations. As Georgina was saying before, Argentina is the fifth country in terms of infected people by COVID-19. This happened from 20th March when we had the confinement, mandatory confinement on a national level. But this has happened especially over the last 2 months when we had the preventive and compulsory confinement, and it was more flexible in this case, which led to a greater amount of infected people. And in Central America and Caribbean, we are the sixth country in terms of lethality of COVID-19. So we have two phases, and we have to take into account that this is a federal country, and I will be talking about this when I talk about this work. The next element that we analyzed were the strategies and policies carried out by the national government on COVID-19, especially from 20th March. It is a government that developed ambitious policies for the workers' rights, and they rapidly established a fund which is an economic help for workers. From $133, it reached 9 million people in the country. And currently we have 44 million of inhabitants. The social fees were frozen, and also there was an increase of unemployment. Oh, sorry. Also, we have to take into account the informal economy, and also loans were established for freelancers workers. This is very important because this amount is 40%. I don't know what is happening with my screen. There was also a food card to give food for families, also some family plans, and there was an extension of unemployment insurance payments. Also, there were pension and other social security benefits, and there was as well an insurance. In the private sector, there were some loans for MSEs, medium and small enterprises, and for employees, they had the assistance and production rate. In this case, the state covers 50% of the salaries, and the other 50% is covered by the private sector. In this case, it was for companies to have a bit of relief so that they wouldn't have to also we have some tax moratorium and some loans for the corporations. We also studied which are the social transfers between April and July. For example, in April, this emergency fund was covered by 20% of population, and currently this allowance is 47%. This is given for all families with children, It was 28% before, and now it is 31%. The retiree fund, 4%, now 5%, and the food card, 19%, and now 36%. We can also see the impact of COVID-19 in terms of households which are in debt. These were seen in cards, in the credits, and also in some customers. And we can also see that especially in the emergency houses, as we call it, in the most poor areas, 25% of the population reported that they were under debt. The main repercussions in the economy was a fall, of course, as in the rest of the countries, in the first quarter of 2020. In this case, was at 6.3%. But in September, this number, which is not included in the report because we finished this report by the end of August, we had a decrease of 12.9%, almost 13%. In terms of unemployment, it is almost 4 million inhabitants. You can see how it increased from 2019, when we had 9.7%, when the neoliberal government stopped with their management. In that case, it was 10%, and now it is almost 3% due to COVID-19. We have also seen an increase in inequality. The poorest sector has very low income. And there were some reinforcements. We can see here the percentage of 32.4% in terms of the universal child assignment and universal pregnancy assignment. There were also some help for food in the community kitchens, and also some installment buying programs called Now 12. And also in the case of some vulnerable neighborhoods, there were some programs, especially when these poor areas began to experience a very high infection rate. I would like to talk first here in terms of informal unemployment, informal employment. These affects especially young adults from 25 to 39 years. In this case, the informality rate is almost 40%, and those who are young, till 24 years, it is 20.6%. Here you can see these numbers. So from 100, almost 72 young people are within this informal employment, or they are not registered as employees. If you have any doubts, we can explain this difference that we make, whether they are registered or non-registered employees. Another element that we analyzed is the impact in gender-based violence. As we can see during the whole confinement, of course, women sadly were victims. We can see that the gender-based violence has tripled. There were 20,000 reports, and we can also see a total of activities in the household which has increased. In many cases, they have to work, but also they have to take care of all the household activities, taking care of the children, and also we have to add the school activities, because schools are closed right now and they are doing all the classes by distance. Here we can see the property, and we can see how the government intervened. There has been some consultations, and there has been a participation from the social organizations. We have to take into account that Argentina is a federal country, so there is autonomy in the 23 cities and in the autonomous city of Buenos Aires. They can decide their policies. And of course, The COVID cases were focused on more urban areas in Santa Fe, in Buenos Aires, in these provinces, but lately there has been an expansion towards the interior part of the country, some provinces that had not experienced COVID in La Rioja, Mendoza. In these areas, now we have seen an increase and they have restrictive confinement. And of course, families are also tired because this confinement feels very long for them, but it is very different depending on the municipalities and provinces. There are 2,000 municipalities and each of them had to articulate with the provinces. Initially, there was an operation plan for the response to COVID-19 with a crisis cabinet. And there was also an interjurisdictional committee, and they generated province committee crisis. And also the legislative power made a transition so that they can develop their activities within the current situation and so that they can discuss and also proceed with the decrees because we have a republican constitution and it was needed to be legislated by the government. Many of the federal forums are doing their work by distance. We have to take into account also the participation of civil society organizations, which has to do with our work, with effective development and how the society participates. There were some crisis committees, and there has been some joint work with the trade unions, with community organizations, with political organizations, with churches, or other movements, and also there were some specific examples. For example, in terms of the education, there were also some consultations with the teachers. You have 3 minutes left, Marita. This is the most important part, crisis, but I will try to be as fast as possible. I will give you some additional minutes, but I just wanted to let you know. Thank you. Here we have to note that there were some flexibilizations and the implementation of every area in the transport sector, in the construction sector, trade sector. There were dialogues between all these organizations so that they could establish some action protocols for every area. This means a multi-stakeholder dialogue. For example, we have the Office Against Hunger, which was something previous to the pandemic and had to do with the social and economic crisis that Mauricio Macri left us. He was in power from 2015 to 2019, and this council is working in 3 areas, and also the social organizations are working in these areas. Which is the deficit? This is something that the CSOs are asking for governments. They just don't want a dialogue, they want an institutional dialogue. In terms of strategies and policies, the civil society has participated in dialogues with United Nations for the implementation of the development strategy for Argentina. We also have an articulation with the National Council of Coordination for Social Policies. They are in charge of the 2030 Agenda with the Sustainable Development Goals. And we also have an instructor, and we developed this in the report. And we also say, and we insist on this, Argentina doesn't need cooperation. We receive very, very little cooperation, but we provide cooperation. And generally, the civil society is not seen as a cooperation agent. Also, as I said before, there were some sectorial councils with the Ministry of Tourism and Work, because of course tourism is one of the most affected sectors, as well as sports. I will be very brief on this. Here you can see the different budget allocations. We talked about this in the report, which is the equivalent in terms of pesos or dollars. In this case, it amounts to 4% of the GDP, the amount that was given to tackle the pandemic. And here I would like to tell you which was our work. For example, we participated in mechanisms of consultations with different jurisdictions to establish action protocols. We also know that the information maybe is not the right one because in terms of accountability, there is a deficit in Argentina because it always comes afterwards to what is going on right now. And finally, all the work carried out by the actors involved. We have to highlight the holistic approach with trade unions and social organizations, and they are developing a process to create entrepreneurship. They were also consulted whether there were some restrictions, and it was proven that effectively there are not on regulatory issues, but in the provinces and the federations, we have seen some violence levels in protests, and especially in the young sector. And in the province of Corrientes, we also saw a selective application. It is not the same, the confinement depending on the sector, but of course, there was a confinement for the most vulnerable sectors. And finally, I would like to say that despite all of this, there has been an alignment with human rights and social protection for workers and for the social economy sectors and also for the unemployed sectors. As I said before, there were some violent practices that are very enraged within the police. And the government has a coalition with the right-wing talk that we have seen in Latin America and also in Europe that they are trying to impose in Argentina. Here we can see some examples that we saw. I was telling you about the holistic program. It's composed of 4,000 neighborhoods with trade unions, with social organizations of popular economy. They have been distributing food with Caritas, with other faith-based organizations, with rural trade unions, which have made a monitoring of child labor to prevent it. Also, faith-based organizations, they have made a work in Lamba, which is the metropolitan region of Buenos Aires and its province in Rosario, Santa Fe. Some NGO organizations like Ethic and Quilmes or Quilas, providing assistance to the elderly or to migrants. And all these organizations are affiliated to Pampa. So this is our way, this is our contact through the Pampa 2030 program. And I am sorry if I talked too much. And thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share our vision.
La verdad que es un trabajo sumamente profundo, muy interesante y les convoco a todas y todos que lo puedan leer para así ampliar la información que corriendo Marita compartió en este momento.
So you can have more information. Thank you very much to everyone. Now it's Laura's turn from Cerrapasos. She comes from Mexico. And in this case, she will share the report on Central America and Mexico. In this work, some members from Nicaragua participated from on Honduras, Salvador, Mexico to establish this report. Thank you very much, Laura. You have now the word. Can we have the PowerPoint in view? Hello? I'm on it. Wait a sec, please. I was having a glass of water. I was speaking very fast, you know. I think the interpreter did a big job. I think she suffered a lot and she will do now. So I'm the director of the CSO of Pueblo in Mexico, and I'm part of the focal group of the CBDE for Central America and Mexico, CAMEX. So first of all, I want to say that this report, for this report, we wanted to include 5 countries that are in this region, in the CPDE, that, as I said, would be Nicaragua, Honduras, Salvador, Guatemala, and Mexico. So there is a lot of information. We have a document of 120 pages. And here we have a summary of 3 pages each that was very hard to do. So before I present this summary, I want to say that we followed an approach based on the guide that was given to us by the CPDE. So we decided we wanted to shorten this guide and we wanted to select some points to cover. So we had 3 virtual meetings to reach a consensus. And then we had the official, also we included the official research and documentation from different CSOs. So we have a very large document. We wanted it to cover all points that were suggested to us. And in this PowerPoint, I will be very fast and I won't read all the information. But just to give you an idea of the extension. So Pueblo was an organization who, and also we had the participation of Georgina Muñoz for Nicaragua, Ronaldo Zúñiga and José Ramón for Honduras, Quintanilla for Salvador, for Guatemala, Henry, Alejandro, Norma, Samuel, and José Luis, for Mexico, Laura Becerra and Eugenia Mata, and in the design we had the work of Nancy Edit. Next slide. We had a larger view on Latin America, and we wanted to precise one thing. Pandemic doesn't mean the end of globalization. We will have a much more despicable capitalism, and we won't have a system substituting capitalism, but we think that the globalization will reduce. The impacts of COVID-19 are very serious, and this is one thing all the colleagues of the region share. The problems and the impact of COVID has a structural origin in a neoliberal model that was applied in this region. So we give this information that I think many of us know, there were some forecasts made by CEPAL for Latin America about this recession. It would be 5.3% of GDP, the worst rate since 1930. And in Central America, economy will be reduced in 2.3%. The unemployment rate will increase by 11 million, over 11 million. So the total rate would be 11%, almost 40 million people unemployed. Now, poverty rate will increase. We see here that in the forecast of CEPAL, generally in Latin America, poverty rate could reach 7.1% of increase. That would be in almost 96 million people in extreme poverty in Latin America. So the case studies for the region assess the measures applied by the government. We wanted to make a summary of the most important impacts of COVID-19. We wanted to assess and identify the measures adopted by governments and to review the role and input of civil society and other stakeholders not belonging to the government in these 5 countries. Let's speak about Nicaragua now. We notice Nicaraguan government didn't decide to decrete the state of emergency. There were no measures taken to contain the crisis. Here we see the number of cases that were reported by the government. Over 4,000 infected and over 100 deceased. There was a citizen observatory for Nicaragua, and this institution reported 2,500 deceased people of COVID-19. Social economic impact. After 2 years of a social political crisis, we see that the economic recession keeps on. There was a good rate of growth before the pandemic, but there is a forecast of decrease for 2020. Here we have data from the World Bank and the IMF, and both agree on a decrease for the economic growth. Nicaragua, or the government of this country, established a commission on the 9th of February. The head of ministry wanted to adopt some kind of preventive measures. The government decided to put forward a community health program to contain the pandemic. Next slide. There is a paradox because government didn't want to close schools and university, promoted mass events. So the government took measures that promoted infections. And on the economic level, there was no additional budget allocation and no economic measures adopted that would have made the situation better. Inclusive associations. In Nicaragua, there are 2 expressions of the civil society, and I think that applies to most countries of this region, CAMEX. There is one expression working directly with the government, which can be consulted, and is more alike to the party in government, and there is another society which is more critical to the measures taken by the government in the context of the democratic freedoms and human rights, and they are not consulted by the government. although they have very important actions to assist the population. Human rights. We see that in all countries there is constant violation of human rights to a larger or lesser extent. It's very impressive, the violation of human rights here, and it got worse due to the pandemic.
Están pidiendo, por favor, desde la traducción, si puedes hablar un poquito más lento.
Claro, pero no voy a poder cubrir a los 5 países. Voy a pedir saltarme una. Sí, Cristina.
I can skip one of the countries because I won't have time to speak about all of them. Because I can read the whole text on the slide. So, CSO, they realize there is a violation of human rights, so there is not a favorable context for these kinds of organizations. They also realized the civic spaces are threatened, there is a lack of information, and other demands in relation to the political and economic context since 2018. And other actions coming from the Civic Alliance in coordination with the private company and other media. Good practices. In Nicaragua, there is no relation between the organizations and the international cooperation. The international help comes directly to the government. And in the study, we realized that there are some international institutions that gave money to contain the pandemic, like the European Union. We highlight that the IMF and the World Bank won't allocate budgets for Nicaragua or resources. Next slide. Challenges and conclusions about Nicaragua. So here we put the recommendations of the organizations for transparency of information, to decree a state of emergency, that there is only one health system under the control of the workers. We need also an emergency budget for health. We need universal subsidies and political liberties and freedoms to this repression. Next country, Honduras. This report was made by Jose Ramon and Donaldo Zuniga. Next slide. Honduras is one of the most affected countries by viral diseases in the region. On 20th of August, there was over 40,000 infected people, over 1,500 deceased. As in other countries, the health professionals and the health system have some problems, and they demand that they should have better equipment.
Con las medidas sanitarias, las fiscales, las crediticias y las monetarias. La que sigue, por favor. El impacto ha sido de gran magnitud, nos dicen los compañeros.
The impact has been of great magnitude, increasing foreign debt. There will be a decrease of -3%, although there are estimates that it may be higher than 6%. Small and medium enterprises that represent the 60% of employment didn't report sales, and they are in a very critical situation. And almost 600,000 people lost their jobs. It is estimated that 75% of the population will fall into poverty, which means that 500,000 people are added to that situation. The population in rural areas, especially indigenous areas, have been marginalized and excluded from the government humanitarian aid, as in many other areas in the region, especially in indigenous and isolated areas. The criminalization of human rights defenders has worsened, and mainly defenders of imprisoned territories. Next slide, please. About property, a decree was issued with a significant amount of resources, and also it was discovered in this case and in other countries that there were some non-legal decrees that were made very fast, and sometimes they were not applied to the measures to which they were intended. In this case, they were in the hands of the big corporations. In the midst of the health crisis, the new criminal code was approved despite the pronouncements of the civil society, as it favored large criminal drug trafficking and corruption structures. The government promoted measures such as extension for tax declaration and payment and support for SMEs. And however, most of the measures and government aid has a client and elite focus. They are given in a very selective way, especially due to the primary elections that will take place next year. The social movement in Honduras is fractured. There are community organizations, however, which are working to defend food systems, family agriculture, and agroecology. They have promoted spaces for reflection and debate, and also have carried out many other activities. Our colleagues say that they have not stopped fighting against extractive activities in the territories, as well as for the protection of the biodiversity. In terms of human rights, women are the most impacted. They have to face a precarious situation. Rates of family and domestic violence have increased. Productive and reproductive work has increased as well. The modality of following the studies through virtual platforms has caused many children to drop out due to lack of resources, because parents are not able to give them that opportunity. They don't have the resources. Laura, you have 3 minutes left. Well, I have to talk about 3 countries yet, so please give me more time, because this is 5 countries. I will not get into detail, but I would like to talk about the introduction of each one. These are the practices for the civil society organizations. Next slide, please. Some conclusions. Well, we have poverty, the risks if they take to the streets. Next slide, please. And some of the challenges are all these proposals made by our colleagues from different organizations related to these topics about investment, governance, and reactivation of the economy. In the case of El Salvador, Rubén Quintanilla from Molex, he is a member of the CPD. In El Salvador, the situation is very serious. The government took previous measures to avoid the spread of the virus. However, the impact is enormous. Here we have a date. We have a number, 27,000 positive cases, placing it above Guatemala and Costa Rica. We also have an economic impact and the measures taken by the government and the president. There will be more people in poverty situation, particularly for women, who are the most impacted, and they are the most vulnerable as well. There is a confrontation between sectors and powers in El Salvador. The foreign debt is increasing and the use of public funds is critical, and there is no strategy to deal with the pandemic. The environment for SSOs has been entirely adverse. They have not been considered, they didn't have resources, and decisions were made not to incorporate them in the decrees so that they wouldn't have support or resources. So they are in a very adverse situation. There was a report from what was going on in terms of human rights in the country, and United Nations talked about this because El Salvador is in a list of 15 countries that have aroused alarm by the action of their security. Some of the conclusions are, well, some demands of what is going on with the country. There is disinformation, violation, and constitutional decrees, etc. In the case of Guatemala, we had our colleagues from CONCEPOC and the organization of Henry, whose pronunciation is really complicated for me, Talking Pop Movement, the one that I am referring to. The government of Guatemala implemented different measures. Here you can see the numbers. In the case of COVID-19 cases, 57,000 were the cases, of which 9,000 are active and 2,000 deceased. But there are some doubts about the veracity of the data because there were some deficiencies for the counting. Guatemala, after Haiti, is the second country with less health coverage in terms of education. Only 17% of homes have access to the use of electronic media, and there is an extreme poverty that will hit 3.5 million Guatemalans. Here you can see the measures taken by the government. There are some programs implemented or announced by the government, and however, there is also unemployment, hospital saturation, and these programs were not able to reach 60% of the population, not even 60%. There's a presence of armed people and all their problems related to evictions, very violent evictions. Next slide, please. The government's conspiracies linked to the economic powers and oligarchies. They have made decisions contrary to the interests of the population, and the business sector says that they have provided humanitarian aid, but in reality, they took very bad decisions and their management was not good. Here you can see the rights that were violated in this crisis. And here you can see some of the demands from organizations to revert these circumstances. In terms of good practices, the CCOs have taken care and invested time to take care of the population and the most affected ones by the pandemic. Women played an important role in different actions for the community. There are also some conclusions related to the public health system. Community authorities have played a very important role in informing the population. Also, women play a very important role, and there is a lack of transparency of compliance with the disposition and proper use of financial resources and materials. Now we have Mexico. This is the introduction. Although it doesn't seem real, Mexico faces a deficient health system. It is collapsed. We are talking about 32 states in this country. It is also a federal government, and the impact and the decisions taken by the government are very different and unequal. So it is complicated to make generalizations. There is a reported shortage of testing. And in the Central America and Mexico region, we are in the first place. Here you can see to date the death. It is 75,000 currently, and we are growing very fast, sadly. Mainly, we are talking about the deceased people in the United States and also the unemployment. In terms of the economy, there is a forecast that it is going to plummet 9.8% during 2020. 25 entities reported that their economic activity was going to be reduced, and there is a lack of transparency, and they generated many doubts. And the population doesn't know how to act because they receive lots of different informations. Here you can see the impact of people that fall into poverty, as well as family violence. And there will be a big recession as well. There is a presidential decree to tackle the pandemic, but here we would like to highlight some problems. For example, the amount intended to attend the affected population is not higher than 2% of the GDP. And they give priority to big projects, but this is very questioned by social sectors. We have a legal institutional framework with CCOs, and with this new government, we don't have a favorable situation because we are not taking into account in the decisions taken by the government. Here we can see the human rights that were violated in this crisis: health, education, work, food. And with regard to good practices, even with the adverse context faced by CCOs, they have various strategies that they have developed. Here you can see the different activities, for example, humanitarian attention, management, capacity building, and guidance, etc. In conclusions and challenges, we would like to say that we have to generate new conditions of health to activate employment, a greater governance and social cohesion, and to promote other activities and also the incorporation of social actors. The other slide, please, the previous one. Thank you. The scenario for our countries, and this is something that we can see in the whole Latin America region, there is an increasing violation of human rights. Also, an accelerated increase of people in poverty, a great contraction of the economy, deep public debt of most countries, loss of formal jobs, disinformation, corruption and impunity, cancellation of strategies to comply with Agenda 2030, corruption and impunity, as I was saying, and the scarce and outdated information on international cooperation. Next slide, please. And well, we will continue to question the neoliberal system. We have to think of this scenario, and we will have to make a critical analysis of the international cooperation, which today responds to the neoliberal approach with a humanist vision, but far from contributing to the modification of the causes that are structural. And also, we have to rethink our work as a social movement because of our priorities and the new normality in the face of the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you very much. Thank you, Laura. And I am very sorry that we had to shorten your information, but we are all sure that we will have the time to read the document.
The presentation of Marita. Solidia is saying hi as well. Our colleague
Also,
from
Olivia
Synergia
Menegatti is saying
Venezuela.
hello.
SGT
CCT
Argentina,
Argentina.
Noa Ruiz is greeting us.
They are sending us some greetings. So we say hello
So
to all of
we
them
greet them
who are
back.
with us today.
Camilo, your
Camilo.
turn. Camilo will share its work, the work done in the Andean region. He's coming from Ecuador, and he will share with us the cases of Peru, Venezuela, and Ecuador, as well as secondary information about Bolivia and Venezuela. Thank you very much. Try not to be very fast. Please keep in mind we are with interpreters. So, can someone tell me that I am sharing my screen? Yes, you are. So, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much to the colleagues that had the talk before me and all the members that are listening to us through Zoom and other platforms. As they said before, we will present an analysis of the Andean subregion. In this report, we had the participation of 3 organizations: the Observatorio de Cooperación in Ecuador, a research center for social development, ANC, from Peru, Imawama, who did the job of contacting the different organizations, and Synergia, the CSO Alliance of Venezuela. So all these members help us give the shape of this report. So I have to say thank you very much to them. I have to remark that women were the ones that did this report. I think this is very important to highlight at the regional level, that data collection and evidence collection was made by women. I think this is a very good sign, a sign of the civil society. Second question I wanted to highlight, which doesn't relate that much with the presentation, is the joy that we express to know that Rubén Fernandez, I have to say, she disappeared and she was found and she was in good condition. We were very worried because she disappeared and we didn't know where she were. That was another point I wanted to make. So I greet her from here and Rubén Fernandez, as well as to all families who have family members who are disappeared. So I have to remind that this report followed a very similar pattern to the pattern provided by the National Union to collect evidence. So we wanted to compare from the organization how are the different responses for the pandemic. In this case, in the Andean region, I think it was very good to make a regional analysis that I will try to present. There is also a study of 190 pages, and it will be very hard to try to condense it in 5 minutes presentation. So we had 3 cases: Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru, but we also did a secondary assessment of Bolivia and Colombia and a regional assessment. So we have 3 main items: the key messages of socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 in this region. After that, I will speak about the principles of the EDC in the response of COVID-19. Here we have these 5 indicators that we all know, and these are the axis of the alliance of CPDE. We have the democratic appropriation, the capacity as organizations and civil society to know and to understand and to advocate in the context of development. Then we have transparency and accountability, as well as national and international and non-government institutions. And then we have the approach on results and the approach on human rights. And finally, we will talk about the principles of EDC in the response of the post-pandemic. First of all, and most important, key messages about the social economical impact of COVID-19 in the Andean sub-region. So I will try to summarize them. First of all, we can say there is a lost decade for Latin America after the progress made by the progressive governments in Latin America. There are many reasons for it that I won't enumerate, but we'll see these problems for Latin America are getting worse. The economy is going back to the levels of 2010. Venezuela is the country where we see the greatest GDP reduction. There is an estimate of minus 26%. After that, Peru minus 13, Ecuador minus 9, Colombia almost minus 6, and Bolivia minus 5.2. That's the first message we see. Second message, crisis doesn't affect everyone as with the same extent. So pandemic is getting as an excuse to get these reasons worse. So their governments are governing for the rich people, for the new rich, and they are creating new rich people every day on Latin America. And they also create more poor sectors in these populations. So we need to understand why do we have this kind of governments. We could see there are some exceptions, like Argentina. Apart from that, we see a big reduction. We have a new millionaire every week, and this elite concentrates 17% of the total richness of the country, with the excuse of the pandemic. There are also loans and credits from the IMF that doesn't help the recovery of these countries. So the SMEs are companies who create more employment, but they receive less support. They give employment to 80% of jobs in Peru, and there is no public policy for these sectors. The unemployment rate will reach 44 million people in this region, and an increase of 18 million with regard to 2019. This is a very, very big alert for us. There are more vulnerable sectors like tourism. These are sectors who are more affected, and they are very important for our economy. So protection system for weakened and dismantled. These kind of systems aim to find some funding, but they are not getting funding enough from the government. aimed to cover this emergency, but there is no labor protection now. And the unofficial economy would reach now 54% of the total employment rate. We are speaking about almost 150 million people. Let's see the increase of poverty, extreme poverty, and inequality. We know, but we need to highlight it again. In Ecuador, the extreme poverty will increase by 5 points. After that, we see Colombia with 4 points, Peru 3.9, and Bolivia 2.5. Extreme poverty will increase, so we changed the cycle that was reducing poverty that was initiated in the last century, but unfortunately poverty is increasing again. Peru is the country where poverty will increase most, 9.3 with regard to 2019. In the extreme poverty in Peru will increase more than the forecast for the whole region. Then we see Ecuador with 7.1, Colombia 5.1, and Bolivia 3.8. Ecuador and Peru are the countries in Latin America where the Gini index will vary the most. We see where the Gini index in Ecuador is the worst because Ecuador is the country who funds less this index compared to the GDP. In Colombia, the variation is between 4 and 4.9, and Bolivia between 3 and 3.9. Impairment of hunger and food insecurity. We will have an increase between 11.7 to 16 million people who will suffer hunger. We need public policies that assist these people with incentives and other bonds. This will increase more in the migrant population. 7 points would be the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women. It's very important here to speak about unemployment. Unemployment will increase 2.5 more in women than men. There are 10 million workers working at home, but mostly are women in the region. Greater chance to be a family worker who doesn't receive any salary, and the big participation of women in the health sector. The educational bridge between rich and poor people. I think this is similar to other countries that we saw already. There are problems with food, with education, there are vulnerable sectors like the rural sector. There is inequality in access to digital media. The lack of social approach for the internet companies. There is no mass free plan for accessing educational platforms in these regions. So we need to make a call to the private sector and its social responsibility, because they are not integrating the vulnerable majorities in this region, and the government and the lack of advocacy and alliances to supply this access for the media platforms. There is a lack of access of programs through classical platforms like television. This boom of new technologies shows once again the digital breach that was already there. Impact of migrant population. There are two big populations. We see the displaced people from Venezuela, who is almost 1.6 million, and the migrant population in Colombia. What is happening with Colombian refugees and migrants from Venezuela? 1.6 million of Venezuelan migrants. There is bigger data about it. It's been terrible with borders. Nowadays, borders are getting very harsh and are very difficult for migrants population. They have no access and they end up with crime bands and human trafficking. This is a very complex issue. In Colombia, 40% of the population is affected. And 40% of population in Colombia could be unemployed, so this will have an impact on the migrant population as well. And the money that migrants send home would be reduced as well. External indebtedness. COVID-19 was a big excuse. We will see that later if I have time. I think I have 3 minutes left. I hope we can discuss this topic later about indebtedness. It's important to highlight that most countries have new debts and they have a limited tax system. There is no increase of taxes. That would be a good chance to make a balance between the tax resources. IMF have approved new flexible credit lines for Colombia in the amount of 10,000 million and Peru 11,000 million. The case of Peru is different. They are negotiating right now. And as they said before, Argentina has the Guinness record of credits with IMF in all history. $50,000 million. Which problems could this have for COVID-19? As they say, we will increase precarity because they want saving measures, they want austerity. And under the excuse of labor competitivity. We already know their agenda from the 90s of last century. I think they did a very good job and we should take a look at their reports. So there is no transparency about these indebtedness. They are very complex. And in these countries, we see new movements emerging against these credits. Here we see some indicators, the social economic impact of COVID-19. We see the increase in the reduction of GDP, the impact on SMEs, the cases of coronavirus in the different countries. We think the best indicator is the rate of disease. If we compare that with the year 2019, the number of diseases have increased, and I think the official figures are not quite true. Here we see the drop of the GDP with regard and compared with the increase of unemployment. Middle class is also in decline. 8 out of 10 people will have income under the poverty line. Also, social insecurity, the increase of extreme poverty, inequality in Ecuador and Peru, food insecurity. Here we see the cases for the different countries. The impact on women. Here we see Colombia would be the worst case, 4.8. If we compare that with the other countries, then Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela would be the next ones. The breach is increasing, the impact on migrants, and talking about health, we see Peru is the only country that has a strategic plan for assisting COVID-affected people. Other countries did have assistance, but they do not have very concrete projects. The level of external debt, here we see with the different funds of IMF, the different indebtedness levels. We see the special case of Colombia, the forecast for debts for this region. We see here how the debt is increasing under this government. And we see how it's increasing even by 20 points. We are worried now. These debts have maturity dates of even 20, 30 years. Peru has a framework, a joint framework, as I said. There is a series of activities coming from the different organizations that aim to strengthen the system. And they want to be heard as well. It didn't function in other countries. There is a harmonization, as I said, in multilateral approaches to canalize the different aid. There are specific dialogues with the government as well. Inclusive alliances. There hasn't been a dialogue here. We highlight that in the case of Peru and Ecuador. I'm finishing now. We see there is a priority for industry chambers and philanthropy sectors and to the bank sector. They have some benefits to get the aid, and they also have some tax benefits. And they do get the attention from the government. So we need to be involved in the public dialogues with the government, because there is a lack of social movements in these spaces, transparency and accountability. There are many difficulties. We don't see review mechanisms that are consolidated in this regard. This is worse now because the state of emergency was decreed, so monitoring is harder now. Approach on results. We see that for Peru, but not for Ecuador and Venezuela. And strategies for COVID. It's hard to access database and human rights. There were many expressions in the civil society and many concerns about the totalitarianism that could emerge out of these emergency states. There is a military control in some cases of daily life. So I think I'm over now and we could discuss it further later. I just want to remind you that we, the organizations, are active and we want to publish a joint text. These are some findings and we can discuss it later. Thank you very much.
Perfect, Camilo. Thank you so much. Now we would like to open a space for exchange and to see the questions that we have received from Facebook. Jose Luis, do we have any questions? Here we didn't get any.
Cristina?
Cristina? Yes, José Luis?
Dos preguntas.
We have two questions.
¿Es común el impacto
It
que
is
se
common,
tiene en
the
términos de
impact
decisiones y de
in terms
políticas
of decisions
gubernamentales
and
en
government
relación al
decisions
COVID
and
y los
policies
recursos
related
de
to
cooperación
COVID-19
internacional?
and the resources for international cooperation?
Una. Y dos, la segunda
And the
pregunta
second question
está relacionada a
is
los
related
fondos
to the funds,
privados en el apoyo social o en el
private funds
apoyo a políticas sociales
in social
en
support
el
for
marco del
social
COVID.
policies in the framework of COVID-19.
Perfecto, bárbaro. Acá
Okay, very well.
¿tiene alguna pregunta?
Here in Zoom, is there any question for the speakers? We could add those questions to the previous ones, and otherwise we will give 5 minutes to each of the speakers. Well, in case there are no questions or consultations, then we will take these two questions from Facebook, and as I was saying, each speaker will have 5 minutes so that you are able to answer, or maybe something that you wanted to say and didn't have the time before. So now it is your moment. Okay, we will keep the same order. Marita, Laura, and Camilo. So remember, you have to answer the questions that we just got. Thank you very much. In terms of international cooperation, I will be linking both questions. This is in the big report, not in the executive summary. Most part of the cooperation that we got was from China, where there were more than 25 flights with containers, especially with medical equipment for surgery, for respirators, etc. And also there was a cooperation for enterprises. I think this had to do with a question from Facebook, and there were some enterprises, especially the Toyota company, which are very involved in cooperation. We also got some projects from United Kingdom, projects linked to civil society, from the Science and Technology Office, from the British Parliamentary. There was a small collaboration also with South Korea, with the European Union, in this last case especially for indigenous communities, for the Rigi community. And there was also a project for migrants and refugees. And here I would like to add what Camilo was saying before. This is linked to the great number of displaced people, especially from Venezuela. And this was a winter campaign, especially for people who are in the streets. The Russian Federation also established some cooperation, especially in terms of technology and research. Argentina has the CONICET system, which is the National Commission for Technological Research. This is very well known on an international level, and they are building the base for one of the vaccinations or promotion of one of the vaccinations that are being tested at the moment. So this is everything on international cooperation. It is always linked to humanitarian aid for development, and this is one of the things that we always say from the CPDE. We always ask that every cooperation linked to COVID-19 is not applied to the allocations for the official development cooperation, because The private sector is always worried about the transparency and accountability, but in this case, we also urge the state, in particular, to be transparent when they share the information on cooperation, because we need a database that is public, with veracity, so that they can inform about the cooperation that we are getting, because otherwise this cooperation is not taken into account, and it doesn't appear in the report on the right time. So this is very important to take into account. Thank you very much, Marita. Laura?
Bueno, como ya les comentaba en mi veloz presentación,
as I was saying you before in my very fast presentation, the information that we have about cooperation with every country, this is not very updated or available, especially in the case of Mexico. We got the information for cooperation after we delivered the report. So now we have this information, and we found some agreements by the government with other countries, but especially in the Mexican case, excuse me, Laura, could you please, Jose Luis, close the microphone, because otherwise we are hearing some background noise. Laura, back to you. Yes, I was saying that for the case of Mexico, more information is given about cooperation processes, and especially what they call Mesoamerica, so there is information on that. They reacted to the crisis in the pandemic, and this is a program that the Mexican government has carried out since last year to support 3 countries from Central America: Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. So in the case of the rest of the countries, the colleagues that participated in the report said that the cooperation that arrives is linked to governments. Maybe Georgina would like to add something else in the case of Nicaragua, but in the case of El Salvador and Nicaragua, the cooperation is mainly focused on official aid from the government, and there is no involvement of civil organizations in the development of these processes and projects to tackle the pandemic. So in this case, the private sector, in the case of Mexico, as far as we know, the Mexican Office for International Cooperation, we are talking about private aid that was intended also for other countries and not specifically for projects linked to the population in Mexico. So there are not specific projects. So as I was saying, there's a lack of transparency and information in development cooperation. We had a webinar prior to this report, and as I was saying in the general conclusions, we still have to review the international cooperation. It is a kind of aid humanitarian cooperation, but under a neoliberal approach, which doesn't necessarily mean sustainable development cooperation. It has to do with assistance aid. So as CCO organizations, we have to review and to send a cooperation that has another reach and which is not under the neoliberal framework but within the development cooperation. And I think that here we have a lot to say as CCOs. We want to have our own agents so that they implement these projects and not involving the society and, in some cases, the government. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Gracias, Laura. Camilo.
Thank you very much, Laura. Camilo.
Hola, gracias, Cristina. Estaba mirando porque
Thank you, Cristina.
de la parte de cooperación dentro del informe, pero pues creo
There was a lot of information about cooperation in the report, but I would say there are some key elements. We have to remember that cooperation has a political side of things. It is not a genuine cooperation, and in our region there is a fight between, let's say, the Chinese Cooperation Office and the one from United States. China, for example, has supported 8 more times the cooperation from the USA. But it is not a genuine cooperation. It is linked to countries where, of course, they have some interests, like, for example, extractivism, hydroelectrics, etc. And, of course, USA has also its own agenda. We would have preferred Colombia and Brazil for these years, but I think the most important thing is to understand this, the logics of geopolitics, so that we understand that there are some priorities, and we have to take into account these, and we have to review how this cooperation is going on, which is its framework. And it is worth it to see the report from STUMIC. In Peru, the national agency, the ANC, sorry, the connection is unstable. There is a cooperation with the European Union for the civil society and also a capacitation of virtual programs. They are also discussing a cooperation with Latin America. And here we cannot find representatives from the civil society. This agency has a great initiative with non-refundable funds. And here I would say that we also need to review which is refundable and non-refundable, and what is cooperation and what not for development. There's also a cooperation for other elements, for example, a political cooperation with Cuba, China, and Russia. They have a power, and this cooperation arrives to the government that was chosen. But in this case, we are not talking about a chosen president, but it is the one who is getting these funds. Also, it is mentioned the case of the Federation of the Red Cross with humanitarian aid. They also have a report on cooperation, especially in the alliance of migrants, and how they are reaching the goal of 2,000 million of euros. But they are not going to reach the 40% of what they should be collecting. There is a multilateral cooperation to tackle the coronavirus, despite the difficulties shown for statistics. In Ecuador, although it is not that easy to have an access to a database, there is a database that is crossed with the Ministry of Health. We are not talking about very high amounts with the USA. We are talking about $6 million, more or less. And also with Japan, they cover 91% of non-refundable aid. And the 9 Other percent is with South Korea, with United Nations, Colombia, and Qatar. And mainly 44% is intended for the health sector and other sectors as well. And family protection is only 0.71% and productivity 0.19% per country or government organization. For the case of NGOs, it is invested, and the most interesting thing is that the USA has 46%, and we also have the cooperation from Spain and Canada. I won't go further into detail, but I wanted to talk about the main elements. I would like to say that the cooperation that we are asking for, I think we have surpassed many agreement cooperations, but we have a very fragmented cooperation, emergent and not strategic. Although this may sound a bit strong, we have to think of which kind of cooperation we want. For example, cooperation to cover this enormous debt that the governments are using to indebt the countries and the next generations, and with a lack of transparency. So if they are going to get into debt, and if they are going to create this debt with the developed countries, the least that we can ask is the transparency. This is key. The access to markets has been closed with the excuse that our products would take the coronavirus. And we are not getting the traditional markets where we were selling before. This is a problem for the food chain, because before we had some access to income. Also, support for states to consolidate the pension systems. There is a worrying concern about the use of these funds and the use of pension systems. Universal systems like the universal income. There are some developed countries where these could be implemented, and this would help very much if this was implemented in our countries to help in this context. It is very crucial to think of cooperation in these countries, because we are talking about basic income, which would be a relief for this population, and especially for the most vulnerable population. To collect funds, in this case, we also want a greater support for cooperation so that the government systems are more solid. We have been asking for this for many years, but this is not in the interest of the so-said donors. This doesn't look as one of the goals for development cooperation, but this is very necessary. Also, the fight against tax paradise. We want accountability, we want transparency, because they are getting money from countries, and some of the credits that we get even require a flexibilization of the tax systems so that there are less taxes for currencies. This is very serious, but this is happening, and it is part of the credit conditionalities that we are given. And of course, this affects us all. And of course, cooperation in health, in access to a universal and free vaccination, and access to the medical equipment that we hope won't be an excuse to generate a death market and a tragedy, but to promote a health cooperation. And finally, I would like to take this opportunity to say that we don't have to use this pandemic for the big enterprises. These enterprises don't have to use the pandemic for the acquisition of public resources and for an extractivist and anti-environment model using the pandemic as an excuse. And of course, we also hope that these people can help us to report these cases and to have a better and more balanced development in our continent. Thank you, Camilo.
So we are half an hour later, but I would thank you all because they were very interesting, very clear presentations with loads of information. So congratulations to every one of you that are fighting and that help prepare this presentation. I just want to take 2 minutes to share two general ideas, and then I will give the floor to Georgina to close this meeting. So thank you everyone who is listening to us via Facebook. We hope that we have a further feedback about these exchanges and we have a deeper analysis of the situation. I think we could see two big proposals coming from the government to address the situation of pandemic. It's very different, the proposal of Argentina that we saw in the analysis of the colleagues of Pampa, compared to the rest of the countries that were also analyzed. One thing is clear. The situation leads that from the civil movements of the society and social movements, we need to rethink which kind of cooperation we want. Like Camilo said in the end, and as we saw in all the presentations, do we want one type of cooperation that promotes this model of development that we are suffering, or do we want a different one, an alternative mode, more oriented to the development of people, the advocacy of human rights, and the elimination of inequality? Clearly, this context of the pandemic, beyond these differences between governments, has been a space of opportunity to increase policies that weren't taking care of people. In this sense, the actions taken by the states to mitigate the effects of coronavirus, they weren't, as you said, homogeneous between countries, and they weren't appropriate. Increase in unemployment, in poverty, increase in debts in almost every country were the elements that you brought up in your analysis. In this regard, we also see one feature. Some actions taken in Argentina, like the money transfers, the emergency tax, the freezing of credits to individual workers, to freelancers, food cards, insurances. We can't see that these actions were taken in other countries. I think this is a very important aspect to take into consideration. And we could also see this difference when we do the follow-up of the consequences in these countries. How the consequences were in the different countries that adopted this model or not. In many countries, they didn't take any measures for infections. In other countries, they did. Here we see another difference that we can take into consideration for the follow-up of this situation. There are more vulnerable sectors by this, women, for sure. The impact of lockdown, the impact of the reduction of employment. These are effects that we see in every country that could lead to a big reduction in some progress that were made in gender and sex policies. Education was affected in all countries, and the difference in access to new technologies. And to finish, I would like to say one thing. We see a different role of social organization with the dialogue with different governments with regard to the common strategies to address this issue. Here we see the case of Argentina. They are talking about a bigger exchange with 3 actors, where we see that civil society is participating, but in other countries they had more difficulties. The participation is also different with regard to the alliance of the alliance that these organizations have with the government. The reinforcement of persecution to people defending territories and human rights. And it was a chance for some countries to have more restrictive laws and measures. So I think I would finish now and I would give the floor to Georgina so that she can close this event. Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you to every one of you who are here. It's been a session during 1 hour and 50 minutes. We saw with clear evidence which project we need to follow to stop the pandemic and how the EDC also acted here. We saw how different approaches were taken by the different governments. What can we do now? So we, as part of the CBDE, we need to provide all this information collected to the different organizations at regional and national level. We also need to share this at the global scene. This is a space that we have, the different organizations. We will be present in November, and it will be the last meeting of all the advocacy we made in this month. And we need to promote and advance in the social dialogue. We need to participate in different platforms as movements. We may not be in the decision-making processes, but we are building spaces, and we see there are civic spaces right now towards NGOs and social networks that want a change. So we invite the governments, we ask them to open the spaces and to think in public policies to transform these processes. We should move on and we should seek resources because these resources cannot come only from the core aid for development, but we also need funds from our own countries. So I think the remarks of Laura, Camilo, Cristina were very, very good. We need to find these resources. We can get them ourselves, coming based on progressive policies. We need to cancel the debt for that. We need to provide ourselves with mechanisms of taxes towards the richest people that are already implemented in the region and we also see them in Africa, Europe, and Latin America. We need to implement them here to finish the inequality we see in our region. So congratulations to all the panelists. Thank you very much as well, the Global Secretariat of the CPDE that was translating this event into English. And we will also thank the other regions and Latin America. Thank you very much.
Gracias a ti.
Hasta pronto. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Saludos a todas y a todos.
Thank you all.
Nos vemos.
Marita, gracias.
Thank you. Good job.
Hasta luego.
Bye. Thank
Felicitaciones a todas.
¿Ya estamos fuera del aire?
No, estamos hablando.
Sí, estamos fuera del aire.
Ya está.
Ah, bueno.
So we're not live anymore.
Camilo, no te preocupes porque
Thank you.
estaba solo retrasado en Facebook.
Ya. Tenía susto que se paró, pero bien, sí veo que sigue.
Camilo, Pampa pide la presentación tuya.
They want to have the presentation. I already sent the presentation of Laura. Thank you.
Esa es la cooperación que quiere Camilo, che.
Hola, Rubén.
Felicitaciones a
Ya pasó, ya
todos.
pasó.
Le felicito.
Thank you. Congratulations.